Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to watch this recording of Domestic Violence 101. I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Lydia Phelps. I'm one of the MSW interns within the licensing and regulatory section. I'm an advanced standing MSW student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The advanced standing program is for students who have their BSW. It's an accelerated version of the MSW program. It's only a year long as opposed to the traditional 2 years. Um, After getting my BSW, I worked in child welfare for about 4 years. I started in Virginia doing assessments and investigations. Then I moved to North Carolina, where I worked in Orange County. Um, and I carried a blended caseload of in-home and foster care cases. So, and to talk a little bit about Survivor Link, this is a program, a public health program partnered with AmeriCorps. It's based out of Arizona State University. They're the leaders of the program. However, they've expanded to different MSW programs across the United States, with one of the partners being UNC Chapel Hill. Um, Survivor Link is a team of students and faculty who work under the guidance of the AmeriCorps mission, which is to strengthen communities and build leaders through team-based national and community service. So during this program, I've received numerous hours on the public health issue of domestic violence. And as a part of this program, I'm required to facilitate and provide trainings on domestic violence to my practicum placement, which is here at the North Carolina Division of Social Services. So here is an agenda for this presentation. We're going to start with taking a pre-test survey, and then we'll finish up with a post-test survey. We're going to discuss the difference between domestic violence and intimate partner violence. We're going to review the power and control wheel. We're going to discuss different forms of abuse, as well as terms associated with domestic violence. And we're going to finish up discussing substance use or substance abuse and intimate partner violence. So here, there's a QR code on the screen that you can scan with your phone that will take you to the pre-test survey. Please, please, please fill this out. This is how I get credit to prove to Survivor Link that I did provide these trainings to my practicum placement. This is also how Survivor Link evaluates if this training is effective and how they can tweak it, make changes to make it more effective, to providing this training to human services or professionals. So when you're filling out this survey, and you're putting in the name of your work site, don't put NCDSS. Make sure you're spelling out, because Survivor Link isn't going to know what NCDSS stands for. So spell out North Carolina Division of Social Services, and make sure you're spelling your name consistently from the pre-test to the post-test so they can link your surveys. So pause this video now, scan the QR link, or the QR code. There should also be a link to the survey in the email with this video, if for whatever reason you aren't able to get the QR code to work. But please do that, and pause the video now. We'll start with a disclaimer. We are going to be discussing some potentially triggering topics. So if you need a minute to pause and step away, please do that and take care of yourself, and finish the video whenever you're ready. So, what is domestic violence? The definition of domestic violence is a pattern of coercive, controlling behavior that can include physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, sexual abuse, or financial abuse. So, the key word in this definition is that pattern of coercive and controlling behavior. So we often hear domestic violence and intimate partner violence used interchangeably, and I will be using those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation as well. Um, so domestic violence can refer, but to break down these definitions, domestic violence can refer to violence among people in a domestic situation, but is also commonly referred are used to refer to intimate partner violence. Domestic violence is abuse or violence occurring within a home. For individuals living in the same household, it can be spouse to spouse, parent to child, child to parent, or violence between roommates. Intimate partner violence describes violence perpetuated by a partner in a romantic or dating relationship. So, in cases where um, a couple, whether that be teenagers in high school or even middle school, where violence or domestic or abuse is occurring, that would be referred to as intimate partner violence and not necessarily domestic violence because they aren't residing together. Um, for the purpose of this presentation, um, I will be primarily focusing on violence between intimate partners, but I'll be using these terms interchangeably. So, who can experience domestic violence? Take a moment and think about who you have seen experience domestic violence, whether that be through your work, through your personal life, or through the media. The answer to who can experience domestic violence is that domestic violence does not discriminate. Anyone can experience domestic abuse, irrespective of age, race, gender, identity, sexuality, disability, wealth, and lifestyle. It can happen in any family type or relationship. These statistics on the slide come from the National Intimate Partner Survey, which is a nationally represented survey for the United States. What you can see here is that both men and women were reporting intimate partner violence since 2010, and that violence is not decreasing. From this graph, it appears that intimate partner violence is occurring very similarly between men and women. Um, this data depicts severe intimate partner violence or reported severe intimate partner violence. Severe IPV can be classified as battering, hitting, choking, or strangling, severe harassment, and stalking behaviors. So, from this slide, you can see there is a distinct difference between men and women reporting severe IPV. So there is a gender differentiation with severe violence. And this is the same for homicide. Women are far and away the victims of homicide, and men are rarely killed in IPV. And if they are killed, it is because of defense. So when men are killed in instances of domestic violence or IPV, it is usually due when they are the abuser and their victim kills them in defense. For some statistics related to IPV with related impact, over 40% of women reported that IPV had impacted their lives, whereas 25% of men reported that IPV impacted their lives. So this related impact could mean anything from needing to call law enforcement because of the abuse, needing advocacy services, needing medical care, injury because of abuse, a concern for safety, PTSD symptoms, or anything that's not within those first categories. So 85 to 90% of women related that IPV had some impact on their lives, whereas only 40% of men reported that IPV had some impact on their life. Here is some data that I pulled from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. This analysis of 2019 to 21 data by the Criminal Justice Analysis Center showed that there was over 20,000 incidents of aggravated assault and homicide committed by a current or former intimate partner or family member within the state of North Carolina, and over 130,000 reports of simple assault, which was the most common form of violence reported. 71% of the victims in 2021 were women, and 81% of these incidents occurred in the residence. This quote over here I pulled from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And this was a quote from a domestic violence advocate in North Carolina. This advocate said, "We are experiencing a severe lack of affordable housing in our area, leading more survivors to return to abusive partners or risk homelessness. Several survivors are also dealing with substance use and mental health concerns, but the gap is ongoing. Sustainable resources makes leaving an abuser exponentially more difficult." This lack of resources tends to be an issue we face on all ends of human services, and we definitely see it in child welfare practice as well, especially in more rural areas of the state. Here is a snapshot of the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel is broken down into different aspects of how violence is perpetrated in attempt to gain power and control over the victim. And we are going to go over some of these sections in more detail. There will also be a copy of the power and control wheel in the email with this video for you to save and use within your own practice, personal life, however you see fit. So, a common perception about domestic violence, is this true or false? Emotional and psychological abuse is not real domestic violence. This is false because emotional and psychological abuse are a form of domestic violence. Emotional and psychological abuse is the most common form of abuse, but is not always seen and it's not always reported. It is the hidden form of abuse and can happen anywhere to anyone. Many survivors report that emotional and psychological abuse is more damaging to them than physical violence. Emotional and psychological abuse is strongly associated with mental health effects of domestic violence, such as depression, post traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety. Emotional and psychological abuse can look like putting the other person down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, playing mind games, making them feel guilty, humiliating them, questioning their identity, and reinforcing internalized phobias. Another form of abuse is physical violence, which is what people would often think of when they hear the term domestic or intimate partner violence. Physical violence can look like hitting, punching, kicking, slapping, strangling, smothering, using or threatening to use weapons, shoving, interrupting sleep patterns, throwing things, destroying property, hurting or killing pets, or denying medical treatment. I do wanna point out that strangling, once that has occurred in the relationship, there is, a huge concern for homicide, due to what data has shown about women that are eventually killed by their abuser. Using intimidation, that's another part of the power and control wheel. This can look like smashing things, abusing pets, displaying weapons, using looks, actions, gestures to reinforce control, standing in front of the door or exit so you can't get out, or stalking. Another common perception, is this true or false? A man should be the head of the household and control the finances. This is false. Someone controlling all of the finances is a form of economic abuse. Economic and financial abuse can look like preventing someone from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money, interfering with work or education, taking credit cards without permission, not working and requiring the other partner to um, provide all financial support, and keeping names off of joint assets. Using isolation, this is another part of the power and control wheel. This looks like controlling what their partner, what they do or what they say, controlling who they see or talk to, limiting outside activities, making them account for their whereabouts, saying no one will believe them when they express they want to disclose the abuse, and not letting them go anywhere alone. Another common perception is this true or false? A person is somewhat justified in forcing their partner to have sex with them if they have had sex in the past. This is false. It is never okay to force someone to have sex, no matter how long it has been since they have last had sex. Forced sex is never okay. Um, Sexual violence is any type of unwanted sexual contact. This includes words and actions of a sexual nature against a person's will and without their consent. A person may use force, threats, manipulation, or coercion to commit sexual violence. Sexual violence can look like rape or sexual assault, assault on a person's spouse or partner, child sexual assault and incest, unwanted sexual contact and touching, sexual coercion, sexual harassment, exploitation and trafficking, non consensual image sharing, and reproductive coercion. Reproductive coercion is forcing someone to become pregnant against their will or manipulating them into becoming pregnant. So, for example, not using condoms correctly or refusing to use birth control or forcing someone to end a pregnancy against their will. And reproductive coercion can happen to men as well. So, becoming pregnant when your partner doesn't want you to be. Next, we're going to watch this short video on consent. All right. So, another common perception, is this true or false? Most domestic violence involves mutual violence between partners. This is false. Domestic violence relies on unequal power dynamics. This idea came from law enforcement, where officers are trained to be unbiased, and if both partners are involved, it can be labeled and reported that there is mutual violence between partners and also in the judicial system. So here's some terms associated with domestic violence. There's unidirectional violence, which is only one partner perpetuating violence. And there's bidirectional violence where both partners are perpetuating violence. So we use the power and control wheel to assess if the violence is unidirectional or bidirectional. So let's talk about defensive violence or violent resistance. It is important to know who is perpetuating the violence in an attempt to gain power and control. So, victims may use violence or force for many reasons, and those include to stop or fight against the abuse that is being used against them, both in the moment or more generally, to protect themselves and their children from abuse, or to try and gain some control over the situation or equivalence within the relationship. The existence of mutual abuse is perhaps one of the most contentious issues remaining in the intimate partner violence field. I generally think of this as both defensive, meaning they are fighting back against overt violence at the moment. Violent resistance is sometimes understood more broadly than defensive violence to include a reaction to coercive control more generally, not necessarily just violence in the moment. So it is important to look at the broader patterns of power and control in the relationship to understand who is the abuser and who is the victim. And like I said, we look at the power and control wheel to understand that relationship or to assess the relationship and attempt to identify who is the abuser, who is attempting to exert power and control in the relationship. So more about defensive violence. Abusers may use this against their partners. Resisting the abuser aggressively can also lead to allegations of mutual violence or couples violence from services that are in place to assist survivors. For example, police or the child welfare system. I think that this is something that I often saw as we would say true domestic violence because it's hard to kind of suss out and see and identify who is the abuser. And I'm not saying that because a victim is fighting back that that doesn't mean that the situation is any less or more safe for a child. um, we have our own policies and procedures that we follow, because our lens is child safety. However, this is the lens from a domestic violence advocate and education on a more broader sense, that in a intimate partner violence relationship, there is always an abuser who is attempting to exert power and control, regardless of the violence that's being perpetuated by the victim. So, this is a particular problem for women of color and the treatment that they receive by law enforcement as well as the child welfare system. So, and just to say a little bit more about that, in relationships where domestic violence exists, violence from the victim is not equal, whether the victim fights back or instigates violence in an effort to diffuse the situation. So, what are some defensive violence motives? The motivation behind defensive violence is to retaliate and or resist abuse, both in the moment or with the intention of preventing future violence. Some examples of this include self or protection of others, um, to stop or escape ongoing abuse, or in response to abuse. Primary abuser motive. The motive of the abuser is to dominate and control the other person. It is important to know who is maintaining power and control in the relationship. And the abuser uses how we went over the different forms of abuse. They use intimidation, emotional abuse like gaslighting, isolation, physical violence, economic abuse, coercion, and threats to exert power and control over the victim. Um, Most cases that are labeled as mutual violence, there is a primary abuser and the other person who is using defensive violence where the motive is to stop the abuse. Okay, moving on. Another common perception, is this true or false? Domestic violence is often caused by alcohol and drug use. This is false. There is a consistent association between alcohol misuse and the perpetuation and severity of physical violence in an intimate relationship, but substance use does not cause violence. Men who use substances are also more likely to use violence. Substance use is often used as an excuse for violence, but does not cause violence. Problematic alcohol and drug use are risk factors for severe violence and homicide. And we see that on our risk assessments that we do in child welfare. We assess for substance use, we assess for the presence of domestic violence and the risk for child safety. And there was a study completed by Dr. Jill Messing, who kind of spearheaded the Survivor Link program at Arizona State University. In her study, it was found that alcohol is not the cause of violence, but it can increase violence. So, what is the association between substance use and intimate partner violence? Substance use exacerbates conflict, unhappiness, and impulsiveness in the abusive partner. Conflict, unhappiness, and impulsiveness lead to violence. Substance misuse itself does not lead to violence, but it is associated with violence. There is a consistent association between alcohol misuse and the perpetuation and severity of physical violence in an intimate relationship. However, substance use does not cause sorry, substance use does not cause violence, but can increase violence. Someone is not going to suddenly become violent when they use substances, and similarly, violence doesn't end when the substance misuse ceases. So they need to be treated separately. And I feel like child welfare does a good job of identifying the separate things. One thing that I really appreciated about North Carolina compared to Virginia was the use of separate case plans and in-home when domestic violence was identified as a concern. So, in summary, domestic violence is common, it's gendered, and it has lasting impacts on the victims. Domestic violence takes on many forms and can look very different across relationships. There can be some relationships where there's no physical violence at all. Um, and the underpinning of domestic violence is power and control. That's why it's important to know our power and control rule and to keep those on hand, especially when we're working directly with clients where that may be a concern. So my next training, this brings me to the end of Domestic Violence 101. My next training will be on how to address domestic violence in your practice and even in your personal life. We're talking about safety assessments, safety planning. I'll be talking about an app that was created by the professors and researchers at Arizona State University um, that helps with safety planning. So I'm excited to give that training as well. And if you have any questions or concerns about the research or anything that I've said during this presentation, please shoot me an email. My email is below, lydiaph@unc.edu. I'd love to talk with you about that. Um, and here is the QR code for the post-test survey. Same as the pre-test, scan it with your phone, or there should be a link in the email to the post-test survey. Make sure that you include your name exactly the same way on the pre-test survey. Put my name in there, spell out North Carolina Division of Social Services or whichever agency you work for. Pause it now to do that. I would greatly appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time.